It began with a whisper, a dark shadow creeping across the land, leaving destruction in its wake. By the time it was over, a third of Europe would be dead. Men, women, children, the strong, the weak, all felled by an unseen force. No one was safe. Entire cities vanished. Villages were silenced. And the world as they knew it would be forever changed. This is the story of the Black Death, the deadliest plague in human history. A disease so devastating it left entire cities in ruins. But what exactly was the Black Death? And how did it become the worst disease in human history? The Black Death is believed to have started in Central Asia, where the bacteria Yersinia pestis, living in fleas, was carried by rats in ships, caravans, and soldiers travelling along the Silk Road into Europe. It spread across the continent in the early 14th century, and by 1347 the disease had reached the Mediterranean shores. From there, the Black Death spread quickly, infecting port cities like Messina in Sicily, Marseille in France, and London in England, ravaging communities and leaving death in its wake. Within months, it would devastate almost all of Europe. Despite popular belief, the Black Death wasn't a single disease, but rather a series of outbreaks during the 14th century. The most common was the bubonic plague, named for the buboes, painful, swollen lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. The septicemic plague and pneumonic plague also contributed to the devastation. Both of these forms could kill a person in a matter of days or even hours. Fleas that were infected with the bacteria would bite humans and transfer the pathogen into the bloodstream. As the bacteria spread, it caused high fever, chills, and the rapid appearance of buboes. It could kill within 3 to 7 days of infection, and death would often occur due to septic shock or organ failure. Despite the majority of the Black Death being bubonic, the nickname itself came from the second, deadlier type, the septicemic plague. When the bacteria spread through the bloodstream, it caused sepsis, leading to tissue necrosis, characterized by blackened skin. Hence the name Black Death. The most contagious, however, was the pneumonic plague. It spread via respiratory droplets when infected people coughed or sneezed. It was highly contagious and capable of spreading between humans without fleas, infecting entire households and towns with terrifying speed. To combat the plague, the earliest forms of quarantine were introduced. Ships suspected of carrying the plague were forced to dock in isolation for 40 days. Plague doctors wore eerie beaked masks filled with herbs in an attempt to make the air they breathed cleaner. Treatments for the plague were largely ineffective by modern standards. Bloodletting, the application of leeches, and the use of poultices were common practices. There were no antibiotics at the time, so the plague was effectively untreatable. Whole families were wiped out within days. Some villages were entirely abandoned, with the dead lying unburied and the living too afraid to venture outside. Armed with only rudimentary knowledge, doctors were helpless against the highly contagious disease, often succumbing to it themselves. The Black Death didn't only cull the population, it disrupted every aspect of life in the communities. Governments were thrown into chaos. With no understanding of the disease, people turned to superstitions and religion. Many people viewed the disease as a form of divine punishment for sin. Flagellants, groups of people who whipped themselves publicly in a show of faith, believed that by suffering they could appease God and end the plague. Some communities also turned to religious practices in desperation. Due to the overwhelming number of deaths, many people were buried in mass graves. In some places, bodies were simply piled up and left in open pits, sometimes without being properly embalmed or buried. The Black Death is believed to have killed between 25 to 30 million people in Europe alone, roughly a third of the continent's population. Some areas were hit harder than others, with cities like Florence saw its population reduced from 100,000 to 35,000 in just a few months. The impact was so catastrophic that it reshaped the very structure of medieval society. With so many people dead, there was a massive labor shortage, and the traditional order began to collapse. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, began to crumble as peasants gained more power and demanded better wages. The Black Death didn't just change people's lives, it changed the course of history. In the aftermath of the plague, Europe experienced a slow recovery. Fewer people meant more resources for survivors, which eventually led to population growth and economic expansion in the late Middle Ages. Wages for workers rose, and many peasants sought better opportunities, giving rise to the European middle class. Some historians argue that the Black Death played a role in the advent of Renaissance, as the disruption of old systems allowed for new ideas, innovations, and art to flourish. The failure of religious practices to stop the plague caused some people to lose faith in the Church, contributing to religious reform movements, including the later Protestant Reformation. The Black Death may have occurred over 600 years ago, but its lessons still resonate today. It reminds us of the importance of medical science, sanitation, and public health protocols in the face of pandemics. It also shows the power of human resilience, as societies eventually rebuilt, adapted, and thrived once more. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating historical content. Stay safe and stay informed.